habang patuloy nating sinusubukan na mabuhay ng normal, napakahirap pa rin po ng buhay natin sa kasalukuyan because we're trying to get everything in order. At kasabay po nito, yung patuloy nating pagsisikap para mabuhay ng normal. Kasama po rito yung pagtatrabaho, we hustle, and hustling is not easy. Hindi po madali ang magtrabaho para sa marami sa atin. Because again, lalo na sa mga breadwinners sa family, and I'm not only referring para sa mga tatay, even sa mga nanay, o kung sino man yung mga nagtatrabaho sa pamilya, hindi po madali to provide food for the family. Hindi po ganun kadali yon. Lalo na sa kapanahunan natin sa kasalukuyan na iba ang sitwasyon po natin. Unang-una, sa lugar po natin, at marami po sa atin, most of us, if not all of us, we're not born with a silver spoon. Hindi naman po tayo pinanganak na tayo'y mayayaman na. Meron po ba ritong pinanganak ng sobrang yaman? Di ba? Hindi naman sa atin ganun, particularly sa lugar natin. Kaya kailangan nating magtrabaho ng magtrabaho. Hindi naman po tayo lahat merong minana or may mamanahin. In the future, sino ba ritong merong mamanahin sa mga magulang nila? In the future, or merong ipapamana, 'di ba? Na mga magulang na merong mga ipapamana sa kanilang mga anak. Wala tayong ganon. Hindi uso sa community natin yung ganong kaisipan na merong mamanahin or may mga ganitong kaisipan tayo. But you know what? When you talk about the Israelites, ang lupain o ang bayang pinili ng ating Panginoon, they also experienced manna, but not the manna na pinag-uusapan natin. Hindi po iyon yung ating pag-uusapan. We're not expecting for manna na ibigay sa atin. But then again, the Israelites experienced this. Naka-experience sila for God to provide for them for the longest times of their lives. At ngayon pong umaga, ang atin pong pag-uusapan ay tungkol sa manang natanggap ng mga Israelita. It's spelled as M-A-N-N-A. Hindi po inheritance na M-A-N-A. Join me po sa umagang ito as I speak on the topic, the manna from heaven and the God who provides, from the book of Exodus, chapter 16, verses 1 to 10. Ito pong miracle na ito na ginawa ni Yahweh sa kanyang lupang pinili, ang konteksto po nito ay kakalabas lamang ng mga Israelita sa kanilang pagkakailipin mula sa Ehipto. They were slaves of Egypt, of the Pharaoh in Egypt for hundreds and hundreds of years. But then again, because of Moses na ginamit ng Panginoon, sila po ay nakaalis sa may Ehipto. At ang huling milagro na ginawa ng Panginoon sa kanilang pag-alis ay yun pong crossing of the Red Sea. At dahil po doon sila ay nakaalis sa Ehipto at hindi na sila muli naging alipin. However, little do they know that it was not the end ng kanilang mga paghihirap. Because in their journey in the wilderness, sa kanilang journey po, sa wilderness experience for 40 years, hindi naman po ito naging madali para sa kanila. Naubos halos yung kanilang mga pagkaing dala-dala. Could you imagine, tatakas sila sa Ehipto, nakaalis nga sila, may dala silang mga pagkain, but definitely that would not be enough to sustain them for 40 years ng kanilang paglalakbay doon sa wilderness. Hindi po naging madali para sa kanila, sa kanila ang mga pangyayaring ito. And so here in the book of Exodus chapter 16 verses 1 to 10, makikita po natin dito kung papaano ipinagkaloob ng Panginoon ang provision na kailangan ng kanyang mga anak. Again, this is the manna from heaven and the God who provides. Remember na dito po sa ating aaraling teksto sa Lumang Tipan, makikita ho natin dito na ang mga Israelita ay nag-grumble. Sila po ay mga galit. Sabi nila, sana namatay na lang tayo doon sa Ehipto. Kaso kahit papano doon, kumakain tayo. hindi tayo mamamatay ng gutom. Hindi tayo mamamatay ng dilat. Pero nandito tayo ngayon, nakaalis nga tayo sa Ehipto, pero lahat tayo gutom naman. But despite of the grumblings of the Israelites, hindi po napigil doon ang pagpo-provide ng Panginoon sa kanila. Basahin po natin Exodus chapter 16 verses 1 to 10. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In verse 2, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. So ang kasama po nila dito, si Moses at ang kanyang kapatid na si Aaron, na naging spokesperson niya. Diba? Kasi itong si Moses, he felt like he was not fit to be the messenger of God because he stutters. Diba? Kaya sabi niya sa Panginoon, pwede po bang yung kapatid ko yung maging spokesperson ko? So silang dalawa ito. Okay. Now, in verse 3, the Israelites said to them, if only we have died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, there we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve these entire assembly to death. In verse 4, then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites in the evening, you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. In verse 9, then Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. Now on verse 10, while Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. May the Lord bless the reading of His Word. Ngayong umaga po, samahan niyo po ako as we journey to this attitude. Thank you, Sai. Ang init po dito sa harapan. Pasensya na po. Ngayong umaga po, samahan niyo po ako as we go through the story of the Israelites. Pakiramdam niyo po, no, pag tiningnan natin dito yung ugali ng mga Israelita, may pagka-attitude tong mga to. 'Di ba? 'Di ba? May attitude sila tong mga panahon na to. Kasi they were freed from slavery from Egypt. And then here they are, already flee from slavery. And what they are doing? They are grumbling against God. 'Di ba? Sila po ay halos nagrereklamo na sa Panginoon dahil wala na daw silang makain. May mga pagkakataon na ganun tayo sa buhay, no? Pag nakita natin, halimbawa, ikaw ay magulang, tapos, halimbawa, dinala mo yung mga anak mo sa mall, pinakain mo ng marami. Tapos, after 3 days, nagtuyo na lang kayo, nagrereklamo yung mga anak, ano ba yan? Tuyo na lang yung ulam natin. Nakalimutan na nung weekend, ang dami niyong kinain sa mall. Right? Nakakalimutan natin yung blessings na nare-receive natin because of the pressing circumstance at the moment. You know, you see the attitude of the Israelites at this time. They were grumbling against God. And it's as if they have forgotten the freedom that they got out of Egypt. Hindi na po sila mga slaves. Hindi na po sila dito pinahihirapan. But what are the lessons that God is teaching us here of the kind of God that He is when He provides for His people? Remember na ang mga episodes po na ito, na ang mga verses na ito, ay nangyari po only 2.5 months after sila po ay makaalis sa Egypt. Mapapansin po natin yan in the first verses of Exodus chapter 16. 2.5 months pa lang, nagrereklamo na po yung mga Israelita, wala na tayong makain dito. Mabuti pang bumalik na lang tayo sa Egypto dahil doon kahit papano, maraming pagkain, naghihirap man tayo. They have forgotten that the life of slavery is the worst kind of life that there could be. You know, pag pinag-usapan po natin ng slavery, ang pinag-uusapan po natin ay mga tao na walang karapatan sa kanilang buhay. They will be doing only what their masters would tell them to do. At kapag hindi na sila kailangan, pwede na silang patayin. Pero dahil nagutom lang sila, ang sabi nila, sana bumalik na lang tayo sa pagiging alipin. Somehow it's quite illogical. But then again, dahil sa kanilang sitwasyon, sila po ay nagrereklamo sa ating Panginoon. But then despite of their attitude, God has provided for their needs. Paano po ba nagpo-provide ang Panginoon sa atin? Despite na minsan may mga pagkakataon na tayo po ay nag-attitude sa Kanya. Na kahit na naranasan natin yung mga blessings niya, we forget that God's provision is very much sufficient. Una po, God is a sufficient provider. As God's power was evident in their slavery, we can see here as well the sufficiency of God's provision in their days in the wilderness. Naging sapat ang Panginoon sa kanilang mga pangangailangan. Nakalimutan po ng mga Israelita that God can actually do wonders for them. Ang dami ng mga miracles na ginawa ni Yahweh sa kanila sa Ehipto. But 2.5 months after they were freed from slavery, they were already grumbling, complaining to God. Wala na kaming makain. But then again, here's God, that despite of their attitude, despite of their predicaments, ibinigay pa rin po sa kanila ang kanilang mga pangangailangan. God has provided for their food in their journey since they have ran out of the food that they have in Egypt. Now, when we talk about the manna from heaven, which is spelled again as M-A-N-N-A, hindi po ito inheritance, ha? Okay, hindi po ito inheritance. When we talk about the manna from heaven, this is a supernatural food. Okay, ito po ay supernatural food na binigay ng Panginoon sa mga Israelita sa loob ng 40 taon na sila po ay nasa wilderness. Again, bakit ba sila nasa wilderness? Why were they freed from slavery? Because it was God's promise for them to go out of Egypt and go to the land that God has promised to them. The land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land. But before they were able to set foot on the promised land, they have to journey in the wilderness. At hindi madali yun because it took them 40 years. 40 taon po silang nagwa-wander doon po sa may wilderness. Pag sinabi pong manna, M-A-N-A, M-A-N-N-A, the literal translation is, what is it? Kasi they don't know eh. Nung sinabi na merong lalapag mula sa langit na kanilang mga makakain, what they were saying was manna. What is it? Yun po yung literal na translation ng manna from heaven. And so, from that literal translation, ang naging ibig sabihin na po ng manna was bread from heaven, angel's food, or spiritual meat. Whatever the translation would be, ang importante pong malaman natin dito, God was able to provide for their needs, for their food. For 40 years na sila po ay nasa slavery. The same way that we know that God will be providing for our needs. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 19, it says, "And my God will provide all your needs according to the riches of His glory in Christ Jesus." All your needs. Hindi po sinabi rito na some of your needs, kundi all of your needs. The quantifier here is all. Lahat ng ating pangangailangan. And mind you that the circumstances of the Apostle Paul here was not that easy. Si Apostol Pablo po ay nakakulong sa mga panahong sinabi niya ito. Hindi lang po siya isang araw na gutom. Siya po ay nakakulong nung sinabi niya, and my God shall supply all your needs according to His riches and glory in Christ Jesus. What kind of person could actually speak of this when they're actually in prison? Nasa selda ka, and this is what you are saying, my God will supply all your needs. Because at least according to the Apostle Paul, he knew very well what it meant to be in abundance. And when he is abased, pag sinabi nating abased, maraming kulang sa buhay niya. But despite of all these, the book of Philippians would actually look at the idea of being content in what you have. Kaya pag tinitingnan niya yung buhay niya, and when he has seen the blessings of God, and what he has lacked, still he was able to say this, and my God shall supply all your needs, according to the riches of His glory in Christ Jesus, and that He will provide for His needs. That's the reason why God is actually called El Shaddai. Right? Anong ibig sabihin ng El Shaddai? The popular translation of El Shaddai is the all-sufficient God. He is the God who provides. And He does not only provide, but He provides sufficiently. Sapat ang Kanyang ibinibigay sa atin. That's the literal translation, the popular translation of El Shaddai. The all-sufficient God. And also when we talk about Matthew chapter 6, verse 11, doon makikita natin yung the Lord's Prayer. Anong sabi doon? And give us this day our daily bread. Right? Why are they asking for the daily bread? Because it's the God of the heavens that provide the bread from heaven, that provided for the needs of the Israelites, and the same God who has provided for the needs of the people in the New Testament. Kasama sa kanyang mga provisions na ibinigay ay yung mga pangangailangan po natin. Matthew chapter 6 verse 11. At dito po nanggaling yung idea natin ng pagiging breadwinner. The bread from heaven, and then from Matthew chapter 6 verse 11, give us this day our daily bread. Pag sinabi mong breadwinner, ano ibig sabihin nun? Siya yung nagdadala ng bread sa bahay. Nag-uuwi ng bread palagi sa bahay. Pero minsan nakakapagod mag-uwi ng bread sa bahay. Pag wala ka nang ibibigay na bread sa bahay. You see, the concept of bread, tinapay, has been there ever since in the Old Testament. From the manna from heaven, the bread from heaven, up to the Lord's Prayer, which says, give us this day our daily bread. Alam niyo po, pag pinag-usapan natin yung pagkain, the best place to eat in Korea is in Gwangju City. Diyan po yung pinakamasarap na lugar kung saan ka pwedeng kumain. It's the fourth largest city in South Korea, and I had the privilege of staying here for 1.5 years. From Seoul to Gwangju, nagpupunta po ako dyan. At kakaiba yung pagkain nila doon. Dahil yung kimchi nila, in particular, is very crunchy. It's very much unlike the kimchi na meron tayo rito sa Pilipinas. Yung pag kinakain mo, yung crunch niya, nararamdaman mo. When we talk about food, right? But also, hindi lang siya yung basta pagkain doon. Because historically, when we talk about kimchi, even though it has become a staple food sa Korea, you have to understand that historically, ang kimchi po ay napaka-importante para sa kanila. Thank you, Sai, again. Because ito pong kimchi ang naging dahilan para mag-survive ang mga Koreans during the Korean War. They had nothing. Wala po silang pagkain. But, because ang kimchi, pwede mong i-ferment at pwedeng magtagal, because of this, the Koreans were able to survive the Korean War. So when I heard of this, and every time nakakain ako ng kimchi, nung naalala ko to, sabi ko, ito pala yung value ng kimchi sa mga Koreans. It's not just a staple food, but this was what made them survive nung panahon ng gera sa kanilang bansa. Much the same case when we talk about the bread from heaven, the manna from heaven. It's not just a simple kind of bread. Remember that this bread sustained the Israelites for 40 years. God provides. And when we talk about the provision of God, He does not only provide for our material needs, but also He gives the supernatural provisions that we need. More than the material possessions. We talk about supernatural provisions. We talk about wisdom. You talk about peace. You talk about grace. And these are intangible things. When we talk about intangibility of things, hindi po siya mahahawakan. And also, these are things that cannot be bought. And these are things that God can provide just the same for all of us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, ang sabi po rito ulit ni Apostol Pablo, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Ano po, ang daming kwento nito ni Apostol Pablo. Because while he was saying this, he was reminded of his thorn in the flesh. And when we talk about the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh in the scriptures, it was not categorically identified if this was a physical thorn in the flesh. Ito ba ay sakit sa katawan? Was this an emotional pain? Or kung ano bang ibig sabihin ng thorn in the flesh na ito? But despite of his thorn in the flesh, ang sinabi niya rito, "But he said to me," this is Jesus Christ speaking to him, "But my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." You know, God's provision is not just a provision na material para sa atin. Because sometimes even if you are showered with a lot of material things, hindi ka pa rin payapa sa sarili mo. Alam mo yung lagi kang kabado, marami kang iniisip. And when we talk about the provisions of God, remember here that the Israelites were grumbling because they forgot that it's the God who freed them from slavery, who is the same God who will be able to provide for all their needs. And when we speak of the word sufficient here, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, this is coming from the literal translation in Greek, which is arche. And when we speak of the words arche, ang ibig sabihin po nito, endurance, strength, satisfaction. In Tagalog, pagtitiis, kalakasan, kasiyahan, kalusugan, kaluguran. And that's when we go to our second point. Our God is a sustaining provider. And when we talk about God sustaining our needs, remember that the Israelites fed on manna not just for 1 year. How long were they in the wilderness? 40 years. At 40 taon din pong pinrovide ng Panginoon ang kanilang pagkain. That's why when we talk about the provision of God, it's sufficient. But it's not only sufficient, but it's also sustainable. Na-sustain yung kanilang mga pangailangan. And mind you, na noong tumapak na sila sa promised land. And when they were able to eat yung mga pagkain doon, that's when the manna from heaven stopped na maibigay sa kanila. Because that was already the most important aspect of the promise. Nandun na sila sa may lupang pangako. In Exodus chapter 16 verse 35, ang sabi dito, the Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. You see, God sustained them for 40 years. And He's the same God who can sustain us sa atin pong mga pangangailangan. Not only in the seasons of wilderness, sa season ng tag-ulan, sa season ng tag-init, sa iba, pag may winter, pag may spring, pag may summer, pag may fall. In Psalm chapter 55 verse 22, it says here, cast your cares on the Lord and He will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken. Tatlong translations po yung kinuha ko dito because you will see here yung pagkakaiba, okay, nung gravity, nung mga salitang ginagamit when it comes to the idea of God's sustaining provision. But if you will go over again here, next slide po tayo on your screen, you will see here that even before God can sustain us, what do we have to do? What's the requirement? You have to cast all your cares. That's the requirement. Why? Cast is a verb here, but cast as a verb here is an imperative. Ito po ay utos. Ibigay mo muna sa Panginoon ang iyong mga burdens. And what would happen after that? And He will sustain you. How can God sustain us if He does not even know what you want for Him to provide for you? If we are saying that God is able to provide for our needs, then importante po na malaman ng Panginoon kung anong pangangailangan natin. Not that He doesn't know, but it's very important that He hears from us what we need at the moment. The requirement is to cast our burdens upon the Lord. And the result will be what? He will sustain us. And what's the reason? He will never suffer the righteous to be moved. Kaya po kinuha ko tong King James Bible version because I love the translation here when it said, He shall never suffer the righteous. If you are feeling down at the moment and you feel like the provision of God is not with you, remember this, He will never let the righteous to suffer. He shall never suffer the righteous. So whatever your cares are at the moment, remember this, all we have to do is to cast all our burdens so He could sustain us, that He will never suffer the righteous. Lastly, God is a supernatural provider. When we talk about the supernatural ways of God, remember that this is not the ways of man. Kaya nga rito, ang iniisip ng mga Israelita, paano tayo makakakain ngayon? Ubus na yung pagkain natin. E nasa wilderness tayo. And when we talk about the wilderness, anong meron doon? Tagutom, drought. Walang pagkain. So they are seeing with their naked eyes yung kakulangan ng kanilang sitwasyon. But then, they forgot to see that their God is a supernatural God. And that He will provide kapag ang ating mga mata ay hindi na nakikita kung papaano masusustain yung ating mga pangangailangan. But you know, sometimes, and for the most part of the lives of the Israelites, when God blesses them, still they have forgotten that it was God who has provided for them. And that is something that we have to be careful with. When God has blessed us with so many things, I pray that those blessings will not be the reasons kung bakit tayo mapapalayo sa ating Panginoon. Because I do believe that at one point in time in our lives, maaring na-experience na po natin that because of the same blessings that we received from God, yung pagtingin natin sa blessing na yun ang naging dahilan din para lumayo tayo sa Kanya. And that's one of the things that the Israelites actually experienced. In the wilderness, they grumbled against God. They complained against Moses and Aaron. They complained against God. They even what? Gumawa pa sila ng kanilang mga Diyos-Diyosan in the wilderness. Because they were thinking that God was not with them anymore. And they have forgotten the blessings of God. And you see here, God is able to provide supernaturally. Subalit may mga pagkakataon that with His supernatural provisions, we are seeing things with our naked eye. And we are forgetting that those blessings are coming from a supernatural God. And sometimes, we're keeping those blessings to ourselves. And we're keeping those blessings away from the giver Himself. That is something that we have to remind ourselves with. But God is a supernatural provider. In Isaiah chapter 58, verse 11, says here, the Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well watered again, like a spring whose waters never fail. Kung kayo po ay naghihintay ng provision ng Panginoon sa kasalukuyan, be reminded of this verse, and this is a promise of Yahweh to all of us. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Wherever you are in life right now, or wherever God is leading you at the moment, remember this. As a popular saying goes, where God guides, He provides. So kung saan man tayo dinadala ng Panginoon sa buhay natin sa kasalukuyan, remember that. Wherever God is leading you at the moment, or wherever God has led you, remember that where He guides, He will provide.